The Ludus of Gnaeus, Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus, sat beneath the shadow of Mount Vesuvius in Capua, a city that had grown wealthy on blood and spectacle, where the morning air carried the scent of olive oil from the presses and the metallic tang of weapons being sharpened in the gladiatorial school's courtyard. In the spring of 73 years before the birth of Christ, 73 men made a decision that would transform them from entertainment commodities into the Republic's most dangerous enemies, though they could not have known that their desperate escape would eventually field an army of 70,000 souls against the legions of Rome itself. The walls of the Ludus were thick, designed to contain men who had been trained to kill with brutal efficiency, and the cells where these fighters were kept at night resembled nothing so much as the cages of exotic predators, which in the minds of Roman citizens they essentially were. Spartacus, a Thracian who had once served as an auxiliary in the Roman military before deserting and being captured, enslaved, and sold into the gladiatorial trade, possessed both the combat skills of a professional soldier and the burning resentment of a man who had tasted freedom and lost it. His wife, a prophetess from his homeland who practiced the ecstatic rites of Dionysus, had been purchased along with him, a detail recorded by Plutarch that reveals how even in bondage some gladiators maintained fragments of their former lives. The conditions within the Ludus of Batiatus were harsh, even by the standards of an institution designed to produce men willing to die for the entertainment of crowds, and the lanista who managed the school maintained discipline through a combination of brutal punishment, starvation rations for those who displeased him, and the constant threat of being sent into the arena in unfavourable matchings. The gladiators represented an expensive investment that needed to survive long enough to provide return through spectacle, yet they also had to be kept sufficiently desperate and hungry to fight with the appropriate ferocity, creating a delicate balance that required constant adjustment and left the men in a state of perpetual tension. Spartacus had fought in the Thracian style, with a small round shield and a curved seeker blade, but others in the school represented the full taxonomy of gladiatorial types: Mumilones, with their fish-crested helmets and rectangular shields; Retiarii, who fought with weighted nets and tridents; Secutores, designed specifically to hunt the net fighters; Gauls with their distinctive equipment, and various other specialists in the choreographed violence that Rome demanded. These men came from every corner of the Republic and beyond its borders, prisoners of war from campaigns in Thrace, Gaul, Germania, and the East, criminals sentenced to the arena, and slaves sold by masters who found them troublesome or simply needed cash. The plot that would rupture into history began not with grand revolutionary speeches, but with whispered conversations about a plan to escape, to break free during a moment when the guards were distracted, though the discovery of this conspiracy forced the timing into a moment of pure desperation. Batiatus or his subordinates uncovered the plot before it could be properly executed, leaving the conspirators with the choice between waiting for certain punishment, likely death or consignment to fights against overwhelming odds, or immediate action with minimal preparation. On the day that would later be marked as the beginning of the Third Servile War, 73 men seized whatever weapons they could find in the moment, which proved to be kitchen implements, cleavers, spits, knives used for preparing the copious amounts of meat required to maintain gladiatorial physiques. The image of trained fighters armed with cooking utensils rushing their guards carries a desperate absurdity that the ancient sources noted, yet these men had been selected and trained precisely because they could transform anything into a lethal instrument, and the guards of the Ludus, despite their own weapons, were not prepared to face a coordinated assault by dozens of men who had spent years learning to kill. The initial breakout succeeded with a speed that suggests the guards were either incompetent, undermanned at that particular moment, or had grown complacent in their assumption that the thick walls and locked gates would do most of their work for them. Once the gladiators breached the armory or storage areas of the Ludus, they equipped themselves with proper gladiatorial weapons and armour, the very equipment that had been used to train them, and the transformation from desperate escapees to a genuinely dangerous warband occurred in the span of minutes. As they fled Capua, the group encountered a wagon carrying gladiatorial equipment to another city. a coincidence so fortunate that it seemed to confirm the divine favour that Spartacus's wife had prophesied, and this seizure of additional weapons meant that the fugitives were now better armed than many military units. The decision to head for Mount Vesuvius rather than immediately dispersing or attempting to flee Italy entirely reveals a strategic sophistication that would characterise the entire rebellion, for the mountain offered defensible positions, water, wood for fires and construction, and most importantly time to organise and plan their next moves. Vesuvius in 73 BC was not the barren apocalyptic landscape it would become after the eruption of AD 79, but rather a fertile mountain thick with vegetation, vineyards climbing its lower slopes, and at its summit within the ancient crater, a flat area surrounded by steep cliffs that appeared to create a natural fortress. The escaped gladiators established their camp in this crater, a position that seemed impregnable from below, accessible only by a single narrow path that could be easily defended by a handful of men against vastly superior numbers. Roman authorities in Capua, initially treating the breakout as a criminal matter rather than a military emergency, dispatched a force of local militia under the command of Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor whose name would be remembered only because of his spectacular failure against men he considered mere slaves and entertainers. Glaber brought 3,000 men to Vesuvius, a force that should have been more than adequate to reduce a band of 70-odd fugitives, and he established his camp at the base of the mountain, blocking the single path down from the crater and settling in to starve the gladiators into submission. The Romans failed to account for men who had survived by improvisation and who possessed nothing to lose, traits that make for dangerous enemies. The gladiators observed that while the cliffs surrounding their crater position were indeed too steep to climb down directly, wild vines grew thick on the mountain's slopes, and these vines could be cut, twisted into ropes, and used to descend the cliffs on the opposite side from where Glaber's forces waited. During the night, while the Roman militia slept with the confidence of men who believed their prey was trapped, Spartacus led his fighters down improvised vine ropes, circled around the base of the mountain, and fell upon the Roman camp from behind, from the direction where no attack was expected or prepared for. The battle, if it could be called such, ended in a rout, with Glaber's militia fleeing in panic and abandoning not only their weapons and armour, but also their supplies, food, and most critically, their military reputation. The psychological impact of this defeat resonated beyond its immediate tactical consequences, for it demonstrated that slaves could outwit and defeat Roman commanders, that the social order itself might be more fragile than the confident pronouncements of senators suggested. News of the victory spread through the countryside of Campania with the speed that dangerous ideas always travel through populations who have reason to welcome them. The region around Capua was thick with slaves working the latifundia, the enormous agricultural estates that had come to dominate Italian farming in the wake of Rome's conquests, and these estates operated on a model that was less agricultural than industrial. Hundreds or thousands of slaves working in chain gangs, sleeping in barracks that were locked at night, fed on minimal rations and driven by overseers with whips and the threat of crucifixion. The expansion of these slave-worked plantations had displaced many small freeholding farmers who had either been bought out or ruined by competition with slave labour and cheap imported grain from Sicily and Africa, creating a rural population of impoverished shepherds, seasonal labourers, and displaced veterans who harboured their own resentments against the Roman aristocracy. When word arrived that escaped gladiators had defeated a Roman praetor and were offering freedom to any slaves who joined them, and accepting any free poor who wished to take up arms, the response exceeded anything the original escapees could have anticipated. Within weeks, the band had swollen to thousands, then tens of thousands, as slaves fled the latifundia and the urban households, as herdsmen brought their knowledge of the countryside and their numbers, as veterans of Rome's armies who had been rewarded with poverty rather than land grants saw an opportunity for plunder and revenge. The composition of this growing army reflected the diversity of slavery in late Republican Italy. Agricultural workers from Sicily, Sardinia, Africa and the East, domestic slaves from Greek-speaking regions prized for their education, mine slaves who bore the scars of the most brutal form of bondage, and gladiators from other schools who brought combat training and the prestige of arena victories. Spartacus emerged as the primary leader, though the sources mention other commanders including Crassus, a Gaul who would prove both an essential lieutenant and an eventual source of strategic division, and Oenomaus, another Gaul who appears less frequently in the historical record but clearly commanded significant forces. The leadership structure seems to have combined elements of military hierarchy with the more democratic traditions of certain Celtic peoples and the example of Hellenistic kingdoms, creating a hybrid system that could accommodate the army's ethnic and cultural diversity while maintaining enough coherence to function in battle. The rebels established a fortified camp and began conducting raids throughout Campania, targeting the villas of wealthy Romans with a methodical efficiency that suggests strategic planning rather than random violence. These attacks served multiple purposes. They acquired weapons, armour, money, food, and other supplies. They liberated more slaves to swell the army's ranks. They terrorised the slave-owning class and demonstrated the Republic's inability to protect its citizens. And they provided the psychological satisfaction of revenge against a system that had treated human beings as agricultural implements. The sources describe how the rebels captured Roman soldiers and forced them to fight as gladiators for their entertainment, a reversal of roles that carried obvious symbolic weight, and how they distributed captured wealth with some degree of equity, which helped maintain cohesion among such a diverse fighting force. The fact that Spartacus managed to keep this army together and directed toward strategic objectives, rather than dissolving into banditry or fragmenting along ethnic lines, speaks to leadership abilities that would have been remarkable in any context, let alone among men who had been selected for their combat skills rather than their political sophistication. Rome's response to the growing crisis revealed both the Republic's military strengths and its political dysfunctions, for while the legions that had conquered the Mediterranean world remained formidable, the command structure was entangled with electoral politics, personal rivalries, and an aristocratic culture that often valued glory-seeking over tactical prudence. The Senate initially underestimated the severity of the threat, treating it as a police action against criminals rather than a full military campaign, an assessment that seems incomprehensible in hindsight, but reflected the deeply ingrained assumption that slaves were inherently inferior and incapable of sustained military success against Roman arms. After Glaba's defeat, the praetor Publius Varinius received command of operations against the slaves, and he too brought what appeared to be adequate forces to crush the rebellion quickly, restore order, and return Rome's human property to its rightful owners. Varinius, however, encountered an enemy that refused to fight according to the expected script, for Spartacus employed tactics drawn from his experience as a Roman auxiliary, from the guerrilla traditions of his Thracian homeland, and from the simple logic that a mobile force facing superior numbers should avoid pitched battles in favour of ambushes, raids, and engagements on favourable terms. The campaigns of 73 BC saw Varinius suffering a series of humiliating setbacks, including the capture of his own lictors and his horse, symbols of Roman authority that the rebels paraded as trophies of their victory over the Republic's pretensions. The praetor's forces fragmented as subordinates attempted independent operations, allowing the rebels to defeat them in detail, and the arrival of winter found the slave army not only intact, but having grown to perhaps 30,000 fighters, controlling significant territory in southern Italy, and demonstrating that Rome's grip on the peninsula it claimed to rule was far more tenuous than anyone had imagined. The winter camp that Spartacus established became something more than a military encampment, evolving into a temporary society where former slaves governed themselves, where women and children travelled with the army, where craftsmen worked forges to produce weapons and repair equipment, where some form of judicial system settled disputes, and where the daily reality of life outside Roman bondage could be experienced and imagined as something permanent. The archaeological record from this period is sparse, for the rebels left no permanent settlements, and Roman sources had little interest in documenting the internal workings of a slave society. But the fragments that survive suggest a community that was simultaneously pragmatic in its organisation and revolutionary in its mere existence. As spring of 72 BC approached, the Roman Senate finally grasped that they faced not a criminal outbreak, but a full-scale war that threatened the stability of Italy itself. Both consuls for that year, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, received commands against Spartacus, a decision that reflected the seriousness with which Rome now viewed the crisis, but also created coordination problems between two commanders of equal rank and competing ambitions. The consular armies, properly equipped legions rather than hastily assembled militia, represented a quantum leap in the military force arrayed against the rebellion, yet they also faced an enemy that had spent a year growing stronger, more organised, and more confident in its ability to defeat Roman arms. The strategic situation that Spartacus confronted in early 72 BC involved choices that would determine not only the rebellion's military fate but its historical meaning. Should the rebels attempt to break out of Italy entirely, crossing the Alps to return to their homelands in Gaul, Thrace and elsewhere? Or should they remain in the peninsula, continuing to defeat Roman armies and perhaps harbouring ambitions of overthrowing the Republic itself? This question of ultimate objectives has puzzled historians for 2 millennia, for the sources provide conflicting accounts of what Spartacus and his followers intended, and it seems likely that the rebels themselves disagreed, with different factions advocating different strategies based on their origins and aspirations. Crassus and many of the Gallic and Germanic fighters apparently favoured remaining in Italy, continuing the profitable raids and inflicting maximum damage on Rome, while Spartacus, according to Plutarch, understood that however many battles the rebels won, they could not ultimately prevail against the full might of the Republic, and therefore should escape while victory was still possible. The tension between these visions created a fracture in the rebel command, and Crassus eventually separated from the main army with perhaps 30,000 followers, mostly Gauls and Germans who saw no reason to abandon the rich pickings of Italy for the uncertain prospect of freedom beyond the Alps. This division of forces proved catastrophic for Crassus, whose army was intercepted by the consul Gellius near Mount Garganus in Apulia, and destroyed in a pitched battle that left the Gallic commander dead and 2/3 of his fighters slaughtered on the field. Spartacus, upon learning of Crassus's defeat, faced the challenge of maintaining morale among an army that had just lost a substantial portion of its strength, and whose invincibility had been shattered by Roman steel. The decision to honour Crassus with funeral games, forcing captured Roman soldiers to fight as gladiators at the pyre of the fallen Gallic leader, served both as memorial and propaganda, demonstrating that the rebels retained enough power to compel Romans to perform the very rituals of humiliation that had been inflicted on enslaved fighters. The games also reinforced group cohesion through shared ritual, transforming grief into spectacle and reminding the survivors that they were not merely fugitives but a people with their own customs and the power to enforce them. Following this ceremony, Spartacus led the army northward, moving through central Italy with a speed that suggests excellent reconnaissance and logistics for an army of perhaps 40,000 fighters plus camp followers. Required enormous amounts of food, water, and other supplies that had to be either carried, seized, or obtained through foraging in the countryside. The consuls attempted to trap the rebels between their two armies, with Lentulus moving to block the northward route, while Gellius pursued from behind, a pincer strategy that should have crushed any conventional force but failed to account for the initiative and tactical flexibility that Spartacus had demonstrated repeatedly. The rebels defeated Lentulus's blocking force first, scattering the legionaries and opening the road north, then turned to maul Gellius's pursuing army, inflicting casualties and seizing equipment before the consul could regroup. These twin victories in rapid succession demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that confounded Roman assumptions about slave armies. For Spartacus had not only won battles, but had conceived and executed a campaign plan that outmaneuvered two consular commanders who had been trained in Roman military doctrine and had access to the Republic's full resources. The road to the Alps now lay open, and the rebel army marched north through the Po Valley, defeating another Roman force under the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Gaius Cassius Longinus, whose 10,000 men proved no more capable of stopping the rebels than the consular legions had been. By summer of 72 BC, Spartacus had led his followers to the edge of Italy proper, to the region where the Alps rose before them, and beyond those mountains lay Gaul, Thrace, Germania, and the possibility of return to homelands and families that many had not seen for years or decades. The historical sources, particularly Plutarch and Appian, record that Spartacus urged his followers to cross the Alps and disperse to their native lands. Recognizing that the rebellion had achieved as much as was possible, and that remaining in Italy meant eventual confrontation with Roman forces too numerous to defeat indefinitely. Yet at this crucial moment, with freedom within reach, the rebel army made a decision that has baffled and fascinated historians ever since. They turned back, marching south again into the heart of Italy, returning to the territory where Roman vengeance awaited them. The reasons for this fateful choice remain contested, with some sources suggesting that the fighters, flushed with victory and enriched by plunder, were unwilling to abandon the comfortable circumstances of their Italian campaign for the uncertain hardships of crossing the Alps and rebuilding lives in lands that many had left as children or had never known at all. Other explanations emphasise that many rebels came from the eastern Mediterranean or Africa, rather than the northern regions accessible via the Alpine passes, making the northward escape route irrelevant to their aspirations for return home. Still another interpretation focuses on the material incentives to remain in Italy, for the slave army had become extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of common people, carrying wagons loaded with gold, silver, fine clothing, and other luxuries plundered from aristocratic villas, and this wealth would be difficult to transport across the mountains, and might attract bandits or hostile tribes once they left Roman territory. Some modern historians have speculated that certain factions within the army harboured political ambitions, hoping to overthrow the Roman order and establish some alternative system of governance, though the ancient sources provide little support for this theory, and it may project modern revolutionary ideologies backward onto people whose consciousness was shaped by very different categories. Whatever the combination of factors, the decision to turn south transformed the rebellion from a successful escape into a tragedy whose conclusion could be foreshadowed, but whose exact course remained to be written in blood across the Italian countryside. The Roman Senate, reeling from a string of humiliating defeats and facing a military crisis that threatened to inspire slave rebellions throughout the Mediterranean world, turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, and a political figure whose military experience was limited but whose organisational abilities and willingness to deploy his personal fortune to equip legions made him an attractive candidate for the command. Crassus, who had served under Sulla in the civil wars and had enriched himself through proscriptions, slave dealing, and a firefighting business that allegedly acquired burning properties at depressed prices before extinguishing the flames, understood that success against Spartacus could provide the military credentials that would elevate him to the first rank of Roman politics, competing with the glory that Pompey was winning in Spain, and that Julius Caesar, still a young man, would pursue in future years. The Senate granted Crassus imperium and authorised him to raise 6 new legions, which combined with the remnants of the consular forces gave him 8 legions totalling perhaps 40,000 men, a force finally proportional to the threat posed by the slave army. Crassus approached the campaign with a combination of strict discipline and strategic patience that contrasted with the impulsiveness of previous commanders, and his first significant act revealed the ruthlessness that would characterise his entire operation. When one of his legions broke and fled in an early engagement with the rebels, Crassus revived the ancient punishment of decimation, dividing the 500 cowards into groups of 10 and having each group draw lots, then executing the one man in 10 who drew the short straw while his 9 companions, who would have faced the same probability of death, were forced to watch and participate in the killing. The 50 men thus selected were clubbed to death by their fellow legionaries, a brutal ritual designed to instill a fear of the commander, greater than the fear of the enemy, and to restore the iron discipline that had conquered the Mediterranean world. The decimation horrified even hardened soldiers, and sent a message throughout the legions that Crassus would tolerate no failure, no cowardice, and no deviation from absolute obedience, creating an army that feared its own commander as much as it feared the slave warriors. Spartacus, now leading the rebels south through Lucania toward the toe of Italy, faced strategic constraints that were beginning to foreclose his options. For while his army could still win battles, it could not sustain an indefinite campaign against the resources that Rome was committing to its destruction. The decision to march toward the Strait of Messina that separates Italy from Sicily suggests a plan to cross into that island, which had been the site of 2 massive slave rebellions in the preceding decades, and where the plantations still held thousands of slaves who might rise if given leadership and the example of Spartacus's successes. The rebels reportedly attempted to negotiate with Cilician pirates for transport across the strait, offering payment for ships and passage, but the pirates, after accepting the gold and silver, betrayed the agreement and sailed away without providing the promised vessels, leaving the army trapped on the Italian shore with Crassus's legions approaching from the north. Whether this betrayal resulted from Roman bribery, pirate opportunism, or simple fear of Roman retribution remains unknown, but its effect was to eliminate the Sicilian option and force Spartacus into increasingly desperate stratagems. Crassus, recognizing that Spartacus was now trapped in the southern peninsula, conceived a plan to wall off the rebels entirely, constructing a line of fortifications across the narrowest point of the Calabrian peninsula, a distance of perhaps 35 miles from sea to sea. This wall, consisting of a ditch 15 feet deep and equally wide backed by a rampart and palisade, represented an enormous engineering undertaking that required weeks of labour by thousands of legionaries. But once completed, it created a barrier that the rebel army could not easily cross, especially since Crassus's legions guarded the fortifications at intervals and could concentrate rapidly at any point where the slaves attempted a breakout. The construction of this wall transformed the campaign from a war of manoeuvre into a siege, reversing the dynamic that had favoured the rebels and allowing Rome to leverage its superior resources and capacity for sustained operations. For weeks, the slave army was trapped behind this barrier, their supplies dwindling, their options narrowing, and the reality of their situation becoming increasingly clear. They faced eventual starvation, defeat in battle attempting to breach the fortifications, or some dramatic action that could change the strategic calculus. During a winter night when snow fell heavily, obscuring visibility and making the guard duty along the wall particularly miserable for the Roman sentries, Spartacus ordered his forces to fill in a section of the ditch with earth, brush, and the bodies of animals, creating a causeway across which the army could charge before the Romans could fully respond. The breakout succeeded in part due to the weather conditions, but also because the rebels threw themselves at the fortifications with the desperate fury of people who understood that this was their final chance, and approximately 2/3 of the army managed to cross the ditch and escape the encirclement before Crassus could seal the breach. The remaining third, whether unable to cross in time or assigned to hold the rear guard, found themselves trapped and presumably annihilated or captured, though the sources provide few details about their fate beyond noting that they perished. This successful breakout, achieved against fortifications designed to be impregnable and held by a commander who had executed 50 of his own men to enforce discipline, demonstrated once again that Spartacus possessed both tactical brilliance and the ability to inspire extraordinary efforts from followers who fought not for pay or glory, but for the chance to remain free. The escape from Crassus's trap, however, provided only temporary relief, for the strategic situation remained fundamentally unchanged. The rebels were still trapped in Italy, still facing multiple Roman armies, and still seeking some route to permanent survival that the geography and politics of the Mediterranean world seemed unwilling to provide. Internal divisions within the slave army resurfaced as some followers, perhaps 10,000 strong under commanders named Gannicus and Castus, separated from Spartacus and began operating independently in Lucania, either because they disagreed with his strategy or simply because the army had grown too large to maintain cohesion under the pressures of constant pursuit. Crassus, demonstrating the strategic acumen that had been lacking in previous commanders, divided his forces and dispatched his legate Mummius with 2 legions to shadow the rebel main army, while other detachments hunted the separated forces, gradually fragmenting the opposition and preventing them from concentrating their strength against any single Roman force. The political dimension of the campaign now intruded as Crassus, despite his considerable success in containing and harrying the rebel army, faced the prospect of having his glory stolen by other commanders whose arrival was imminent. Pompey the Great, who had been campaigning in Spain against the remnants of the Marian faction, had crossed back into Italy with his legions and was marching south, nominally to assist in crushing the slave rebellion, but actually to claim credit for ending the war and thereby diminish Crassus's achievement. Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus, brother of the famous Lucius Lucullus, who was campaigning in the east against Mithridates, had landed at Brundisium with forces from Macedonia and was also moving to engage the rebels. The prospect of sharing credit with Pompey, his political rival, or worse, arriving late to a battle that Pompey claimed as his victory, drove Crassus to seek a decisive engagement with Spartacus before these reinforcements could arrive and dilute his glory. Spartacus, meanwhile, faced his own pressure for a climactic battle, for the strategy of evasion and manoeuvre that had sustained the rebellion for over 2 years was reaching its limits as Roman forces converged from multiple directions and the space for manoeuvre contracted towards zero. The sources suggest that Spartacus attempted to negotiate with Crassus, offering to withdraw from Italy if granted safe passage, but whether these negotiations were genuine or merely a stratagem to gain time remains unclear. And Crassus in any case rejected any settlement that did not involve the unconditional surrender of the slave army. The rebel commander then made the fateful decision to march north once more, perhaps hoping to break through the Roman forces and gain the open country of the Po Valley, or possibly intending to engage Crassus in a decisive battle that might shatter the Roman legions and create one final chance for escape or permanent settlement somewhere beyond Rome's immediate reach. In the spring of 71 BC, in the region of Lucania near the headwaters of the Silurus River, the slave army and the legions of Crassus finally met in the pitched battle that both commanders had come to recognize as inevitable. The accounts of this final engagement differ in details but converge on the essential elements. Spartacus, knowing that defeat would mean death or crucifixion for himself and his followers, killed his horse before the battle to demonstrate that he would fight to the death and would not flee the field, then led his forces in a desperate charge directly at the position where Crassus commanded, attempting to kill or capture the Roman general and thereby throw the legions into confusion. The tactic had worked in previous battles where commanders had been killed or their headquarters overrun, but Crassus was better prepared and better supported than Glaber or Varinius had been, and the legions held their formations as the rebels crashed against their shields and Pila like waves against a seawall. Spartacus fought with extraordinary courage, attempting to cut his way through to Crassus himself, killing 2 centurions who tried to stop him, but the mass of Roman soldiers was too deep and too disciplined, and he was eventually cut down, though the sources note that his body was never definitively identified among the thousands of corpses that littered the battlefield. The slave army shattered in the face of the Roman assault, with some fighters attempting to flee north only to encounter Pompey's legions arriving from that direction, while others scattered into the hills and forests of southern Italy where they were hunted down over the following weeks and months by Roman forces intent on ensuring that no nucleus of resistance survived to reignite the rebellion. Crassus's legions killed an estimated 60,000 rebels on the battlefield and in the immediate pursuit, a staggering casualty count that reflected both the desperation with which the slaves fought and the mercilessness with which the Romans prosecuted their victory. Among the dead were Gannicus and Castus, whose independent force had been destroyed shortly before the main battle, and presumably most of the gladiators, herdsmen, agricultural slaves, and displaced poor who had joined the uprising, hoping to escape bondage or poverty, and instead found death at the point of Roman swords. 6,000 prisoners were captured during and after the battle, and Crassus, determined to send a message that would prevent any future slave from contemplating rebellion, ordered their crucifixion along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a distance of over 100 miles. The condemned were spaced along the road at intervals of perhaps 40 or 50 yards, creating a corridor of agony that travellers would pass for months as the bodies slowly decomposed, a visual sermon on Roman power and the consequences of resistance that required no words to convey its meaning. The crucifixions were likely not simultaneous, but stretched over days or weeks as prisoners were processed and executed, with each victim nailed or tied to a cross and left to die from exposure, asphyxiation or shock. A death that could take hours or days depending on the individual's constitution and the particular method of crucifixion employed. The scale of this punishment exceeded even the mass crucifixions that had followed previous slave revolts, representing a theatre of terror designed to reach every slave in Italy and beyond, with the message that the social order was inviolable and that challenging Roman supremacy would result in suffering too extreme to contemplate. Pompey, arriving in time to intercept and slaughter 5,000 rebels who had fled north from the main battlefield, immediately wrote to the Senate claiming credit for ending the war, asserting that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in battle, he himself had extracted the root of the conflict by eliminating the survivors, a claim that Crassus found infuriating but was unable to effectively refute given Pompey's political connections and rhetorical skills. The rivalry between these two men, exacerbated by the dispute over credit for ending the Spartacan rebellion, would shape Roman politics for the next decade, contributing to the formation of the First Triumvirate and the sequence of events that would ultimately destroy the Republic, a reminder that even the most dramatic slave uprising was, from the perspective of the Roman elite, primarily a stage on which their own ambitions and conflicts played out. The Senate voted both commanders' triumphs, though Crassus received only an ovation, a lesser form of the triumph that did not involve the full procession through Rome and carried less prestige, a distinction that reflected Pompey's superior political connections and the senatorial class's lingering prejudice against celebrating a victory over slaves rather than foreign enemies. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion saw intensified security measures on the latifundia and in the ergastula, where agricultural slaves were confined, with owners investing in heavier chains, higher walls, and more guards to prevent any recurrence of the nightmare that had just been suppressed. Yet the fundamental economics that had created the conditions for rebellion remained unchanged. Italy continued to be worked by vast slave populations living in brutal conditions, the wars of conquest continued to supply fresh captives to the markets, and the small farmers continued to be displaced by large estates, creating the same volatile mixture of oppression and resentment that had exploded into war. No significant reforms were implemented to address these structural issues, for the Roman aristocracy depended on slave labour for its wealth, and was unwilling to consider alternatives that might reduce profitability or require them to treat their human property as something more than agricultural implements. The lesson that the elite drew from Spartacus was not that the system was unsustainable, but that it needed to be defended more vigorously, that any sign of slave resistance needed to be crushed immediately before it could grow into something larger, and that the consequences of rebellion needed to be so severe that they would deter even the most desperate from attempting to follow Spartacus's example. The legacy of the rebellion rippled through Roman culture in ways both obvious and subtle, entering the historical tradition through writers like Sallust, who may have written a lost account of the war, and later historians like Plutarch, Appian, and Florus, who preserved the memory of Spartacus even as they interpreted his rebellion through the lens of their own times and prejudices. These sources present conflicting portraits: Spartacus as noble savage who fought for freedom and distributed plunder equitably, Spartacus as pragmatic leader who understood the limitations of his strategic position, Spartacus as gladiator who simply wanted to escape but was trapped by the contradictory desires of his followers, each interpretation revealing as much about the author's assumptions as about the historical Spartacus himself. The sources agree on his military skill, his courage in battle, and his ability to command an extraordinarily diverse force, but they provide frustratingly little detail about his political vision, his long-term objectives, or his internal motivations beyond the obvious desire to escape slavery and avoid recapture. The rebellion also entered Roman political discourse as an example invoked by various factions to support their arguments, with conservatives pointing to the uprising as evidence that harsh discipline of slaves was necessary, and any relaxation of control would lead to chaos, while populist tribunes occasionally used the memory of Spartacus to critique the latifundia system and advocate for land redistribution to small farmers, though always carefully distinguishing between the legitimate grievances of Roman citizens and the illegitimate resistance of slaves. The gladiatorial games continued and indeed expanded in the decades following the rebellion, suggesting that Romans drew no connection between the brutality of the arena and the explosion of violence that had nearly destroyed their state, or perhaps more cynically, that they recognized the connection but considered the entertainment value of the games worth the risk of creating more trained fighters who might eventually rebel. The ludus of Batiatus in Capua presumably continued operations, perhaps under new management if Batiatus himself had been killed during the initial breakout or its aftermath, training new generations of gladiators to die for the amusement of crowds who remembered Spartacus as a name synonymous with danger and defiance, but who had little interest in examining the conditions that had created him. Modern interpretations of the Spartacan rebellion have varied enormously, depending on the political and ideological context of the interpreters, with Marxist historians viewing Spartacus as a proto-revolutionary leading a class struggle against ancient capitalism, liberal historians emphasizing the universal human desire for freedom and dignity, and conservative scholars stressing the criminal and destructive aspects of the rebellion, and questioning whether Spartacus had any coherent political program beyond immediate survival. The 20th century saw Spartacus transformed into a symbol deployed by various political movements. Communist parties in Europe claimed him as an ancestor of proletarian revolution, with the Spartacist uprising in Germany taking its name from the Thracian Gladiator. Hollywood created the romanticized narrative that has shaped popular imagination through Kirk Douglas's portrayal in the 1960 film, and novelists, playwrights, and other artists have continually returned to the story as a canvas for exploring themes of freedom, resistance, and the human capacity to fight against overwhelming odds. The historical reality, stripped of these later accretions, reveals a rebellion that was simultaneously more complex and more contingent than the simplified narratives suggest. 73 men who escaped from a gladiatorial school because their alternative was death or continued bondage, who discovered through a series of victories that it was possible to defeat Roman armies who attracted followers from across the social spectrum of the oppressed and dispossessed, who maintained cohesion long enough to field armies that could devastate Italy for over 2 years, who made strategic decisions that remained debated and opaque, even in the sources closest to the events, who ultimately failed not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they faced a state with resources and resilience far beyond anything their army could match, and who were punished with a systematic brutality designed to ensure that their example would terrify rather than inspire. The crucifixions along the Appian Way stood for years as weathered monuments to Roman power, visible reminders that the social order would be maintained regardless of the cost in human suffering, and that any challenge to that order would be met with violence sufficient to deter even the desperate. The question of whether Spartacus could have succeeded under any circumstances invites counterfactual speculation that historians generally avoid, but that the dramatic nature of the rebellion makes irresistible. If the army had crossed the Alps when first given the opportunity, could the fighters have dispersed and returned to their homelands before Roman vengeance caught them? If the pirates had honoured their agreement and transported the rebels to Sicily, could a new front in the war have been opened that might have stretched Roman resources beyond their limit? If Crassus had not split from the main army, or if the division had been managed differently, could the combined force have defeated Crassus's legions before Pompey's reinforcements arrived? These questions ultimately cannot be answered definitively, but they reveal the multiple contingencies on which the rebellion's fate depended, and suggest that the outcome, while likely given the balance of forces and resources, was not foreordained from the moment 73 men seized kitchen knives and rushed their guards in Capua. The impact of the rebellion on the institution of slavery itself was negligible in the short term, for the latifundia continued to operate much as before. The slave markets continued to supply labour from Rome's conquests, and the fundamental structure of the Roman economy remained dependent on the exploitation of enslaved populations. In the longer perspective, however, the memory of Spartacus may have contributed to a gradual shift in how some Romans thought about the treatment of slaves, with writers like Seneca in the following century advocating for more humane treatment and recognition of slaves' humanity, though these philosophical interventions had limited practical effect on the lives of the enslaved themselves. The rebellion also demonstrated to Roman military commanders the dangers of underestimating opponents based on their social status, a lesson that would be periodically forgotten and relearned throughout the empire's history, as various provincial populations and internal groups challenged Roman power and occasionally succeeded in defeating legions whose commanders assumed that Rome's cultural and military superiority would compensate for tactical or strategic errors. The individuals who fought and died in the rebellion remain largely anonymous beyond the handful of names preserved in the historical sources, their stories absorbed into the collective narrative of the slave army, without individual distinction or memorial. The agricultural workers who fled the latifundia, the domestic slaves who abandoned their masters' households, the herdsmen who brought their knowledge of the countryside, the gladiators from other schools who joined their escaped comrades, the women who travelled with the army and whose presence in the sources is noted only in passing, the children who were born in the camps during the rebellion's 2-year duration. All of these people made choices and took actions that shaped the course of events, yet their voices are lost to history except as filtered through sources written by and for the elite class that owned them. This erasure from the historical record is itself a form of violence that compounds the physical violence of crucifixion and battlefield slaughter, denying the rebels even the memorial that Rome's enemies like Hannibal or Mithridates received in recognition of their threat to Roman power. The military innovations and tactical approaches that Spartacus employed influenced Roman military thinking in subtle ways, for the rebellion had demonstrated the effectiveness of mobile warfare, the importance of secure supply lines, the vulnerability of forces operating with divided command, and the danger of underestimating an enemy's capacity for strategic sophistication. These lessons were absorbed into the institutional knowledge of the legions and may have influenced commanders in subsequent campaigns, though crediting specific tactical developments to the Spartacan War is difficult, given the paucity of detailed military analysis in the sources. What is clear is that Roman commanders after Crassus showed greater respect for the potential military capabilities of non-state actors and irregular forces, treating bandit groups, tribal coalitions, and other unconventional enemies with a seriousness that earlier commanders had reserved for organized kingdoms and established states. The economic disruption caused by the rebellion had significant but temporary effects on the Italian countryside, with agricultural production interrupted, villas destroyed, and the normal commerce of the peninsula disrupted by the presence of hostile armies, ranging across regions that should have been peaceful and productive. The recovery from this disruption was relatively rapid by ancient standards, suggesting that the fundamental infrastructure and labour force of Italian agriculture remained intact despite the rebellion's violence, but individual estates and families suffered permanent losses that the sources rarely document in detail. The slaves who did not join the rebellion, whether because they lacked opportunity, feared the consequences, felt loyalty to their masters, or simply calculated that the risks outweighed the potential benefits, experienced intensified surveillance and harsher conditions in the rebellion's aftermath as owners implemented security measures designed to prevent future uprisings, creating a bitter irony in which those slaves who had not rebelled suffered punishment for the actions of those who had. The psychological impact of the rebellion on Roman society extended beyond the practical security measures, touching deeper anxieties about the stability of the social order and the reliability of the foundations on which Roman prosperity rested. The realization that thousands of slaves, the human tools that Romans used as casually as plows or wagons, could organize themselves into armies capable of defeating consular legions, and could maintain that organization for over 2 years, challenged fundamental assumptions about natural hierarchy and the inherent superiority of the free over the enslaved. These anxieties were typically managed through denial and reassertion of traditional categories. Slaves had not really achieved these victories through their own abilities, but rather through the incompetence of the early commanders. The rebellion had not really threatened Rome's existence, but was merely a criminal outbreak that was crushed once proper forces were deployed. Spartacus was exceptional, and his success could not be replicated by ordinary slaves who lacked his military training and leadership qualities. These narratives allowed Romans to acknowledge the rebellion's reality, while containing its implications, preventing the kind of systematic examination of the institution of slavery that might have led to recognition of its moral bankruptcy or practical unsustainability. The religious and cultural practices of the rebel army, barely mentioned in the sources, remain one of the great mysteries of the rebellion, for an army of 40,000 or more people living together for 2 years must have developed some form of collective identity, ritual life, and cultural expression beyond the purely military. Spartacus's wife, described as a devotee of Dionysus who prophesied his great destiny, presumably continued to practice her religion within the rebel camps, and other followers likely maintained their own religious traditions from their diverse homelands, creating a polyglot spiritual landscape that reflected the army's ethnic diversity. Whether Spartacus attempted to forge these diverse traditions into some unifying ideology or cult, or whether he permitted religious pluralism as long as it did not interfere with military effectiveness, cannot be determined from the available evidence, but the question points to the larger issue of how the rebels conceived of themselves and their movement. Were they simply fugitives seeking freedom? Or did they develop some sense of collective purpose and identity that transcended individual survival? The comparison between the Spartan rebellion and the earlier servile wars in Sicily reveals both continuities and significant differences, for while all three uprisings arose from the brutalities of mass slavery and the concentration of enormous enslaved populations on agricultural estates, the Spartan rebellion differed in its military sophistication, its ability to defeat Roman armies in open battle, and its capacity to threaten Italy itself rather than a peripheral island. The Sicilian rebels had proclaimed kings and established alternative governments with courts and councils, suggesting political ambitions that Spartacus either did not harbour or did not have opportunity to implement, while Spartacus demonstrated a military talent that the Sicilian leaders apparently lacked, defeating not just local militias but consular armies and achieving a level of operational success that exceeded anything the earlier rebellions accomplished. These differences may reflect Spartacus's personal abilities and military background, or they may suggest that the conditions in late Republican Italy created different possibilities and constraints than those that existed in Sicily, or some combination of these factors that we cannot fully disentangle given the limitations of our sources. The role of auxiliary and allied forces in the Roman response to the rebellion raises questions about how non-Roman populations within the Italian Confederation viewed the slave uprising, for these communities had their own enslaved populations and their own reasons to fear a successful rebellion that might spread beyond its original participants. The sources provide no indication that any Italian communities supported or joined the rebellion, suggesting that ethnic and civic identifications proved stronger than class solidarity, and that free poor people, despite their own economic struggles, identified more with the Roman order than with enslaved rebels, a pattern that would recur throughout history as dominant groups successfully fragmenting potential opposition along racial, ethnic, and status lines. The absence of significant non-slave participation in the rebellion, beyond the herdsmen and displaced persons who joined in its early phases, indicates that Spartacus never succeeded in, or perhaps never attempted to build a coalition that crossed the fundamental divide between free and enslaved, a limitation that ensured the rebellion would remain a servile war rather than becoming a broader social revolution. The failure of the rebellion to generate significant literary or artistic production from the rebels themselves, in contrast to other historical uprisings that left manifestos, chronicles, or other texts, reflects both the educational limitations of most slaves and the thoroughness with which the Roman victory erased rebel voices from the historical record. We possess no first-person accounts from participants in the rebellion, no letters or speeches by Spartacus, no poems or songs composed by the fighters, nothing beyond what the Roman sources chose to preserve or could observe from outside. This silence is not accidental but structural, the result of a society in which literacy was concentrated among the free, and especially the elite, and in which the victors controlled the transmission of historical memory. The act of reconstructing the rebellion from hostile sources requires constant awareness that every detail comes filtered through the perspective of those who viewed the slaves as property and the rebellion as a criminal conspiracy, that sympathetic elements in the sources likely reflect the author's literary or philosophical interests rather than accurate transcription of rebel perspectives, and that the entire narrative as we possess it is shaped by absences and silences that we can note but cannot fill. The military career of Crassus following the rebellion demonstrates how success against Spartacus, despite the ambiguities about who deserved credit for ending the war, could be leveraged into political advancement within the competitive arena of late Republican politics. Crassus used his military credentials to claim the consulship and eventually to secure command of the campaign against Parthia, where he would meet his death at Carrhae in one of Rome's most devastating military defeats, an ironic end for the man who had suppressed the most dangerous slave rebellion in Roman history. The fact that Crassus's greatest military achievement was defeating slaves rather than foreign enemies never entirely disappeared from his political profile, and rivals could always subtly denigrate his military reputation by contrasting his victory over enslaved gladiators with Pompey's conquests in the East, or Caesar's subjugation of Gaul, suggesting that even a successful suppression of a slave rebellion carried less prestige than victories over properly constituted states and armies. The question of what might have happened if Spartacus had captured a major city like Capua, or even Rome itself, invites speculation about whether the rebellion could have transitioned from a mobile military campaign to a sustainable territorial state, and the evidence suggests that such a transition would have been extremely difficult, given the rebels' lack of naval power, their inability to prevent Roman reinforcement and resupply by sea, and the fundamental challenge of governing and defending fixed positions against an enemy with vastly superior resources and institutional capacity. The decision to remain mobile, to avoid becoming trapped in cities that could be besieged, reflected sound strategic judgment given these constraints, but it also ensured that the rebellion could never achieve the kind of permanent territorial foundation that might have allowed for diplomatic recognition, alliance with Rome's enemies, or transformation into an enduring polity. The rebels existed in the liminal space between military force and political community, capable of defeating armies but unable to establish the administrative structures, diplomatic relationships, and economic foundations that would have been necessary for long-term survival. The fate of slaves who did not participate in the rebellion, but who lived through its course and aftermath, encompassed a range of experiences from those who were punished, despite their non-participation, to those who were rewarded by grateful masters, to those whose situations remained essentially unchanged. The sources provide almost no information about this vast population, whose lives were undoubtedly affected by the rebellion, but whose individual stories did not rise to the level of historical notice. One can imagine the conversations in slave quarters throughout Italy as news of Spartacus's victories arrived, the calculations about whether to flee and join the rebels or remain and hope for the best, the fear of both Roman retribution if one stayed and potential defeat if one fled, the family bonds and personal relationships that kept some slaves from abandoning their situations even when opportunity presented itself, and the despair that must have settled over the slave population when the rebellion was finally crushed and the crucifixions along the Appian Way demonstrated the cost of resistance. The military logistics of maintaining an army of 40,000 to 70,000 people on the march through Italy for over 2 years represents an extraordinary achievement that the sources largely take for granted, but which required sophisticated organisation and planning. Such an army would consume enormous quantities of food daily, require fresh water sources, need fodder for animals, produce waste that had to be managed to prevent disease, require blacksmiths to repair weapons and equipment, need scouts and intelligence networks to identify Roman forces and locate supplies, and face all the challenges of maintaining cohesion and direction among a diverse population under constant military pressure. The fact that Spartacus managed these challenges while simultaneously winning battles and evading encirclement speaks to organisational abilities that would have been remarkable in any context, but especially so considering that his officer corps was drawn from men who had been selected for their combat abilities rather than their administrative skills. The impact of the rebellion on the gladiatorial profession remains difficult to assess, for the sources do not indicate whether the flight of gladiators from other schools during the rebellion led to increased security at the Ludi, or changes in how gladiators were recruited, trained or supervised. The fundamental economics of the gladiatorial business presumably remained unchanged. There was still demand for spectacles, there was still supply of prisoners and slaves who could be trained to fight, and there were still profits to be made by lanistae who managed schools and provided fighters for games. The rebellion may have introduced additional risk into these calculations, raising the cost of security and perhaps reducing the number of gladiators kept in any single location, but the institution survived and indeed flourished in the imperial period, suggesting that Romans drew no lasting lessons about the dangers of training large numbers of skilled fighters and confining them in conditions that generated resentment and desperation. The environmental impact of moving such large forces across the Italian landscape, while not discussed in the ancient sources, must have been substantial, with forests cleared for firewood and construction, water sources potentially contaminated, game animals hunted to local extinction, and agricultural fields stripped of crops either by the rebels foraging or by Roman forces denying supplies to the enemy. The recovery of the Italian countryside from these depredations is not documented in detail, but the sources suggest that Italy returned relatively quickly to productive agriculture, implying that the damage, while significant in the short term, did not permanently compromise the land's fertility or the infrastructure of rural life. This resilience may reflect the fact that the rebellion, despite its dramatic military victories, did not involve the kind of systematic destruction of agricultural capacity that would characterize later civil wars or barbarian invasions, with both sides recognizing that they needed the countryside to remain productive enough to supply their forces. The legal aftermath of the rebellion involved questions about the status of property seized by rebels, the fate of estates whose owners had been killed, and the disposition of rebels who had been captured but not executed. Roman law treated slaves as property without legal personality, creating complications when slaves had seized property themselves. Did the seizures constitute theft that could be punished and reversed? Or had the property effectively changed hands in ways that Roman law was not equipped to address? These questions, if they were resolved at all, left no trace in the legal sources that survive, suggesting either that the solutions were ad hoc and particular to individual cases, or that the Roman state simply reasserted previous ownership claims without engaging with the legal complexities that the rebellion had created.